Tuatahi me mihi kātika ki te kaupapa. Tautoko ana ngā mihi ko whāriki hia tēnei ata I tēnei rā, kāti rā, ki runga I tātou te hungora. Kia ora everyone, my name is Thomas Malcolm from Waikato Regional Council, Kāhui Māori and with the Māori Biosecurity Network. Before we start, I just want to read out a quote, I quite like it. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I am contradicted." I think it's wise words to live by in a discussion like this, with a lot of depth and a lot of opinions, probably. Did you not see the lynch mob outside? Aroha, you were blind walking in. All right, so today we're here to talk about who owns genetic data, or who owns biodiversity genetic data. The session's going to run with the panellists each speaking for about 5-7 minutes, introduce themselves and a bit of background on the topic, and then we'll move to the floor for questions. House rules, basically, I'm the boss, so what I say goes. And you'll see some mics roaming around as well. When you do have a question, wait till the mic gets there just so we can capture it, because it is being live streamed and we are recording it, so just hold off until that mic gets there. And if you don't, you have to sing a song. All right, so first we're going to introduce Peter Dearden. He's a geneticist working on understanding the evolution of animals, especially insects, form and using that information to help beneficial insects and kill pests. Peter is a director of Genetics Otago and leader of the Lab in a Box project. As you can tell, I'm reading this for the first time myself, so please welcome Peter.
Thanks. I hope all of you took the opportunity over tea to go and see Lab in a Box. I'm not actually going to talk about genetic data at all, just make sure you all go down and see my famous blue box. Go, please. No, it's really cool. Honestly, and there's bees in it. I am, as stated, a geneticist from the University of Otago. I am actually a really weird geneticist because I trained as an insect geneticist, and there are very few of us left in the world. And I also started my training studying Drosophila, the fruit fly that everyone likes to laugh about. You know, we know more about genetics and fruit flies than we know about the genetics of almost anything else. Good, that's because of me. Well, it's not, but you know. But the point about fruit flies is that actually when that field started, it was started in about 1910, and there was an agreement amongst the people who started working on that insect that all data would be shared. Everything would be freely available. If you published a paper that said a particular thing using particular reagents, then those reagents would be available for everyone else, freely given. And this means that actually Drosophila research has always had this underlying current that everything in the scientific community working on that insect is freely given on application. So if you publish something, you are obliged to make that available. That ethos actually comes all the way through to modern genetics, and it's kind of surprising to me. Geneticists like myself are often regarded as some of the worst people in the world. If you've seen the latest Jurassic Park, you'll notice that the really evil guy's the geneticist, not the big bitey dinosaurs, right? We are awful, we're horrible, we tend to play God, that's the thing, we play God. But actually it's hard to reconcile that with the fact that actually the standard practice for the use of genetic data amongst genetic scientists is that it is freely available and publicly available. So when you publish a piece of research which contains genetic information, it is your obligation to make that freely available to the public, which explains why databases like GenBank are there. That means that if I publish something, you should be able to download that data, even if that's high throughput sequencing data, even if that's the whole genome of something, all of that information is supposed to be available. And that's a good thing, right? That enables geneticists to work collaboratively across the world to build information based on that public available data and to move the field ahead, right? Obviously, there are some problems with that. Some of those problems are about human genetics, where it's very clear that we have to worry about the ownership of genetic sequences. And of course, when we, I think, are dealing with Indigenous communities and their guardianship over biological specimens, then clearly, again, we have to worry about how freely that is available. But I'd like to argue on this panel, and in fact loudly in the bar afterwards, that actually the freedom is the really important thing. Freedom to access information allows it to be, in some respects, democratized. One of the problems is that that democracy perhaps doesn't go far enough because it's available to every one of you in this room as long as you know where to go, and perhaps people don't know where to go and they don't know how to analyse that data. But that freedom has been a key part of the success of genetics as a science, and I think there have to be good reasons, and there are good reasons, why we would not want that to occur with information about biological diversity. Can I shut up now?
All right, home te paki paki.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Sorry, I'm just trying to take notes, but you talk really fast, Peter, so... no, it's fine.
We talk fast in the south because it's too cold, right? Conversation's over quickly.
So up next, we've got Senior Lecturer Tami Stevens. Is a conservation geneticist who has the privilege of working with a number of admittedly lesser known taonga species and is happiest when she is being of some use. She is hopeful that her contribution to the conservation today will be just that.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Home te paki paki.
Tanna Koto. Now you'll see with Peter and I, we're used to having 50 minutes to make our point, so I've actually written mine down, because otherwise we would be here for 50 minutes listening to me. So I'd like to first acknowledge Mel for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I'd also like to mihi to my colleagues here on the panel. And I really have to begin by saying that I'm feeling a bit whakama or shy about speaking on a panel with two formidable Indigenous scholars, and I'm just really thrilled to be here. So kia ora to you both. Now, I also have to admit, I don't usually shake, but I'm actually shaking. So I've come here today. I'm okay though. I'm okay. I'm all right with it. I'm owning it, okay? So I've come here with some trepidation, but that's okay. As a Canadian, I'm clearly not from here, Canadian-born Toiwi, or a non-Māori scientist, I'm keen to stand in alliance, as Kim said earlier today, with my Māori colleagues, but I'm equally keen to avoid inadvertently becoming the poster child for well-meaning, but equally demeaning cultural appropriation. So for any inadvertent slips into this space during our kōrero, my sincere apologies. Now the question. So who owns biodiversity genetic data? Now before I actually consider ownership, I'd first like to ask, what is genetic biodiversity data? So from my perspective as a conservation geneticist, and for today, to keep things relatively straightforward, I'm going to focus my lens on threatened endemic Taonga species. So this actually isn't a necessarily easy question to answer. So in the conservation genetics space, until recently, for most of these species, this has meant a handful of genetic markers scattered throughout the genome, or hopefully scattered throughout the genome, for some, most, or all individuals of a particular species. Now today, at best, and we'll hear more about it tomorrow, we're talking about having a platinum genome. So this is a high coverage de novo, flash way of saying new genome that's chromosomally assembled and gene annotated. So think kakapo. That will then be used as a reference genome for a series of low coverage resequenced genomes for some or most, or in the case of kakapo, eventually all individuals for a species. Now at worst, and maybe worst isn't a thing, but at worst we're talking about the use, the equivalent of sort of one of these kind of bronzy genomes, not quite as flash as a platinum genome, and we use it as a landing pad genome, so a reference genome that'll do to identify tens and thousands of SNPs that we might want to use to look at diversity, for example, across a genome. And we might do that for some or most or all of a particular species using something called a reduced representation approach. Now, I've used all kinds of words that I'm not really worried about you actually knowing, but the point here is that it's not all about having these big, beautiful genomes for a species. In fact, some argue that there's no such thing as the kaki genome, no such thing as the hihi genome, because a genome is actually the genome of this species, which includes many, many individuals. So with this raw data, effectively, is this what we're talking about? Is this biodiversity genetic data? It's the raw data. Or is it the information that will ultimately glean from these data? Or is it both? I'm not really sure, but I surely know that I want to talk about it. But I've only got 5 to 7 minutes. I talk fast, but not that fast, so I'm going to move on to ownership. So, another confession. I really struggled, and Mel will attest to this, I really struggled with the concept of ownership, only because of my background and because of where I'm coming from. I readily admit that it's an exceedingly and necessarily complex question. So from my readings, I'm aware that it can include or exclude ownership, control, access, and possession. But simply put, I don't have the mana to explore this question head on. So instead, I'm going to address it from a different perspective, one that I'm much more familiar with. And to me, it's being addressed in a different but related way. So rather than asking who owns biodiversity genetic data, I'm asking who benefits from biodiversity genetic data. And I'd like to use two brief, relatively recent examples. So 2015, Leduc et al. Published a study for the North Island brown kiwi genome. Leduc et al. Is predominantly German-based scientists and one New Zealander who's no longer based in New Zealand. There is a collective uproar by New Zealand-based scientists, both Māori and Pākehā. Now, out of interest, the DNA for these North Island brown kiwi were collected from bloods from birds that were part of Operation Nest Egg. So a couple of years later, as in literally last month, two Norwegian-based scientists have published a series of complete mitochondrial genomes. So this isn't all the DNA that's in the nucleus, but all the DNA that's in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. And two of those particular species are endemic Tauna birds, Huia and South Island kokako. And where the samples were obtained for these particular data was from topad samples obtained from museum skins. So these would have been birds that were collected in the mid to late 1800s, perhaps very early on in the 1900s for Huia. And the question is, what do we do with this? Why, personally, do I have a visceral reaction to this? But at the same time, can I see the benefit in these data? And who is it benefiting when I think about it? So beyond ownership, as Peter said, in a Western science context, geneticists share. That's what we do. That's how we were brought up. So the raw data from both of these studies is publicly available. We can get at it. So one could argue that the publication of these raw data is not a zero-sum game. We could argue, I'm going to say something else completely different that I wrote here. It says, indeed, when I was interviewed about the publication of the kiwi genome back in 2015, I said, and this scared me to go and find it to see if I would agree with it still, using a high-quality genome like that generated for the North Island brown kiwi will allow for the development of species-specific genomic resources. These resources will provide a more accurate representation of genome-wide diversity and better inform conservation management strategies to minimize the loss of genomic diversity, particularly for threatened species like the North Island brown kiwi. Now, I know when I was subsequently interviewed by Alison Ballance, I also did talk about the disappointment of the fact that this genome had been published by German-based researchers with little, if any, meaningful involvement from local communities, including Māori communities. So this is true. It's true that we can now access that North Island brown kiwi genome. We can use it to develop resources not only for North Island brown kiwi, but also for other threatened kiwi species. But does the end justify the means? Probably not. But let's talk about it. And I'm going to talk about it briefly and then stop. So I'd again like to paraphrase Kim's talk from earlier today, if I may. If Māori communities, including Māori researchers, aren't at the table, questions that are responsive to the needs and expectations of those communities won't be asked. So I suggest where we lose when Tauna species genomes are sequenced overseas with little or no meaningful engagement, it takes us longer to address the questions that matter. And when we're working with species on the brink of extinction, time isn't exactly on our side. That's me. Kia ora.
I'm quite impressed, honestly, how many good points we put into that short amount of time you had, so well done. A lot of you will understand this, but in Te Ao Māori, or in Māori world, if the more famous someone is, the closely related you are to them. So with that, I'll introduce my auntie. Aroha Te Pariake Mead is from Ngāti Awa and Ngāti Porou. She's a Chair Emeritus of the International Union of Conservation of Nature, Commission on Environmental, Economic and Social Policy, a global multidisciplinary network she chaired from 2008 to 2016 and was a member of the IUCN Governing Council from 2000 to 2016. She's a specialist in traditional knowledge issues, including Indigenous, cultural and intellectual property policy, and has published extensively on these topics. She currently serves on a number of national and global boards and advisory bodies, including the Kahui Māori Deep South Climate Change National Science Challenge, Repatriation Advisory Panel. English is my second language, by the way, people. Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Expert Group on Diverse Values and Valuation of Nature, and is also Chair of Board of the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Assessment based in Cusco, Peru. She was previously the Director of Māori Business at Victoria's Business School and Policy Manager of the Cultural Heritage and Indigenous Issues Unit of Te Puni Kōkiri, and as I mentioned, she's my auntie. Kia ora.
Kia ora, nephew. Tēnā koutou katoa. You know, for some, dealing with the issue of genetic data is seen as a step removed from the moral and ethical considerations required for genetic research, because it is information rather than the physical genetic materials. But in a traditional, cultural, Indigenous and Māori perspective, however, to separate data from its origins, its context, is yet another practice of deconstructing a holistic Indigenous worldview and of dehumanizing and removing the integrity of the life force of the environment, species, and of humans. Genetic data does not sit in a vacuum. It has a whakapapa. It comes from something. It has a context, and in some ways it has a modi. It is the product of genetic research and therefore requires the same ethical safeguards and processes as genetic research itself. In many ways, the data and interpretation of data is the most important component of genetic research. As we know, interpretation of data is not a neutral, objective activity, much as many scientists would like to argue it is. A case in point is the Māori warrior gene debacle, carried out on a sample size of 17 individuals from the same community, and with the results extrapolated for the entire Māori population, to the detriment of Māori. So the issue of the conduct of science and of genetic research was included in the statement of claim for the Waitangi Tribunal 262 claim, otherwise known as the Indigenous Flora and Fauna claim. This claim was lodged in 1991 by 6 iwi. There were hearings throughout 1998 to 2001 and again in 2006. And the tribunal released its report in July 2011. In describing the Y262 claim, the tribunal says this, that the place of Māori culture, identity and traditional knowledge in New Zealand laws and policies and practices was the main purpose of the claim, that it concerns who controls Māori traditional knowledge and the place in contemporary New Zealand life of core Māori cultural values, such as the obligation of iwi and hapu to act as kaitiaki or cultural guardians towards taonga treasured things, such as traditional knowledge, artistic and cultural works, sacred and significant places, flora and fauna significant to iwi and hapu identity. And as I mentioned, genetic research on Indigenous flora and fauna and on Māori individuals, whānau hapu iwi, was explicitly included in this claim. Although government has yet to provide an official response to the tribunal recommendations, let me just make a few observations from that report and from things that I have learned myself. So the tribunal said that it's time, well overdue, in fact, for a more respectful and mature relationship between Māori and the Crown and New Zealand society as a whole. And that treaty principles should not be seen as a shopping list for people to choose which one they want. They come as a holistic group, and they include everything from free, prior, informed consent to tino rangatiratanga of hapu and iwi. They also make the point that there seems to be a lot of confusion about what is a Māori interest in an issue and how do you determine whether there is a Māori interest. And my response to that question is that if an issue is important to New Zealand, then it is important to Māori. And really finding the Māori interest is as simple as that. Good, sound research protocol should cover from access to storage to use, including secondary use, to the return or disposal of samples, and the interpretation and dissemination of data, and for Māori to be involved in all stages. The notion of open data or open data on species and the environment in order to ensure sound, informed decision-making is important, and I'm generally supportive of this principle. However, to me, that is not the decision of an individual researcher to make. That is part of the research protocol, that's part of the negotiation with Māori. And in my closing comment, I just want to say that I often find in discussions around Māori and science that there are gross generalisations made in both areas. And I don't think it's particularly helpful to progress discussion when those generalisations are made. And with the greatest respect to my fellow panellists, this notion that both of you put, that geneticists as a group somehow share a common value of open data doesn't stack up when you look at geneticists working in the private sector. So to just give this idea that anyone who is a geneticist, irrespective of where they work, has a fundamental belief in open data is not an accurate portrayal of the issues that people have to face. And in the same way, on the Indigenous side, no one is claiming that the Indigenous way is the best way, that the Indigenous knowledge about species is the most profound. That it's really, as I'm saying, a negotiated discussion between all. Kia ora.
Kia ora roa tautoko ana o kōrero. It's good to, it's refreshing to see the mirror put on ourselves as well as Māori. Like, it's not about we have the right way, it's about sort of everyone working together and moving forward. Lastly, our last panellist needs no introduction. You heard her speak upstairs and know how amazing she is. And I'm sure if you do your research, you'll probably find out she's related to me as well. Associate Professor Kim TallBear.
So I feel like I got a lot of time this morning, and so maybe you can surmise what I might say about this topic. So I have just a few quick points, and I'm also kind of embarrassed to come after Aroha, who is somebody that I've known for a while and really look up to, and has been a role model for me, actually. So there's a few things. I used to work a little bit, or at least have coffee with Rasmus Nielsen, who's a geneticist at Berkeley, and who I believe was one of the co-authors on the recent paper on the Anzac child, which I think are 11,000-year-old remains found in what is today Montana on private land. And that project involved what the lead scientist, Eske Willerslev in Denmark, is calling collaborative research, but from a really rigorous standpoint of collaboration. I wouldn't call it, it's not a rigorous collaboration, it's a consultation more like. But what was interesting about Rasmus Nielsen is he has very quietly behind the scenes, and this is being live streamed, so I won't give a lot of details, but really called other geneticists into a place of greater humility. And he wrote a blog just out of his lab. He's got a lab blog that he wrote back during an earlier moment of the Kennewick Man case, which I guess I didn't talk about that one today too much. But he said, you know, maybe the tribe doesn't own the DNA, but neither do the scientists. And that was kind of that kind of made some people open their eyes, because what he was trying to highlight was the assumption that science owns these resources. That gets me to another point of intersection with Georgina Stewart when she was speaking in this room earlier. I really loved that talk about in a sense, the misguided nature, although we can't probably completely step back from it, of trying to translate between Indigenous languages and scientific languages. And that is also a problem related to the translations between Indigenous languages and scientists and English. If you look historically, Indigenous languages have been translated, and that project has often been guided by the desire of the colonial state to have access to our language in order to further the colonial project. So if you look at my own people, our dictionaries, Dakota dictionaries, were written by Presbyterian missionaries, and they just completely destroy and evacuate the meaning of some words because they're trying to translate those words into things that make sense in English and into the 19th century civilizing project. And so we have to think a little bit about the inadequacy of our translations. Now, this makes it difficult because we can't completely back away from translation work. And I said this earlier today that I think that we are at a moment when we need to do that hard work, but we have to understand that it's always going to be incomplete. So when I hear conversations about the term ownership, and this is what I'm coming around to, I really don't like that word, but we use that even in defending Indigenous rights now. We talk about Indigenous dispossession of our land, of our resources. The word "our" is problematic. Dispossession is problematic. It's really what it is it's a disruption of relations, right? And that's why I'm saying I'm not going to talk too long, because I went over this in great detail this morning. But we're stuck trying to translate into these hierarchical, objectifying terms that English brings us, and then we have to come to a policy-making table and talk about who owns data, right? So we're in a severely compromised ontological position already. It's not just a translation problem. It's we are inhabiting really different, sometimes conceptual universes, but then I come back into a moment where I do want to encourage translation because I want different Indigenous intellectual universes to seep more into the actual world that we have to inhabit, which is why I say I call people into relation. So that was my second point. And then the third point goes back to something Peter was saying earlier, which was reminding me, because you said you worked under Sofala too, and that's what that scientist, Therese Markow, worked on that I was talking about earlier. One of the things I didn't say is when she was defending her rights to do that research and downplaying the poor informed consent that they did, one of her defenses, and she never backed away from this that I have yet seen, and this stuff hit the news back in 1993, she said, knowledge is for the good of all. Knowledge is not the knowledge produced out of her lab and out of these research institutions is hardly ever for the good of all. And so we need to, as a lot of people have talked at this meeting, talk about the hierarchies that are involved in these institutions. Who is it good for? Who gets to form the questions? Whose methods count? Whose sets of ethics count, right? So that also will then come into thinking about a freedom of data and democratization. So what do we mean by democratization? We probably have some really different definitions of what that might look like. So I think going back to questioning the sort of fundamental use of terms that we have is a really good place to start conversation, and to always be aware that we are using really, really compromised terms, and that's just the way that it is. And so this is, again, I'll just say one more thing, why it's important for people who want to engage in collaborations with Indigenous people. And somebody came up to me after my talk today and was asking about how to do that. I can't give you a recipe for that. What I can say is you have to want to make this kinds of translation work, reestablishing different kinds of professional and personal networks a bigger part of your work. And in a world in which you are encouraged to publish quickly, get to publication quickly, this is not going to be the work that everybody wants to do. That's just the fact. The best collaborative researchers that I know tend to be younger, more critical scientists. They might be self-identified as feminists quite often, and I didn't get back to that this morning, because they believe in really looking very clearly at the kinds of hierarchies that exist within the laboratory, that exist out within the nation state. And they have agreed or become interested enough to make this hard collaborative work a bigger part of their work, to the point where they start then publishing on methods. They start publishing on ethics. And again, this is taking you into a different kind of career space, right? And not everybody's going to want to do that, which is why when I hear people say, well, you know, to work with Indigenous communities or other communities, I just can't, you know, I can't do it that way. And then I say, well, then don't do it. Go work on Drosophila. But don't try to work with complex human beings, right? Because you've got to, in a sense, embrace the difficulty of the politics and then make that a bigger part of what you become an authority on and the things that you write about. So it definitely changes the terrain of your work. And either do it well, or make a commitment to doing it well, or go do something else.
Cool. So I've started taking some notes, but I'll do a little summary at the end perhaps. So what we'll do now is open up to the floor. Any questions? Just remember, if you do have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a mic across to you so we can capture that. Oh, yep, up front here. It's coming.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you for all of your brief talking. I really enjoyed it. I had lots of questions pop in my mind, but one of the ones that I think, I just sort of wondered, we're talking about some of these challenges that we have. Is there any real thoughts around some of the solutions about how we can actually start resolving that sort of the paradox or the relationship and the governance around the access to biodiversity and therefore the access to information and the way that science engages? So one of the things that came to my mind was most recently the Wanganui River Treaty Settlement came out, where in fact, you know, you talk about rights and ownership. That was actually quite a unique and I think quite an important step forward in terms of giving effect to the partnership, and that actually finally recognised the Maori, the mana of the river, and that the river was itself, and in fact the relationship was then given effect to through a governance relationship between the Crown and the iwi to frame the future decision making in the way that New Zealanders and Maori and everyone related to it. And do you think that could be a type of model for actually framing Vision Motoronga and things and going forward and trying to actually so to actually get beyond the talk and actually say, well, how do we give effect to these ideas?
Don't be shy.
My response is maybe not going to be what you expect. But one of the things that it's very consistent in government responses to Māori claims of tino rangatiratanga, and that is it will go to the nth degree to do everything and anything other than giving title back to Māori, unconditional title. Just handing over the resources, giving back what was taken, and saying they're yours to do with as you wish. So I don't wish to demean the Whanganui River settlement or what happened at Uruwera, because they are a step forward, they're innovations, but they also come from this mindset that will even give nature a legal personality rather than give Māori legal rights, exclusive rights to maintain and manage resources. But I think at another level, I would like to think that we've all matured as professionals in the work that we do and in the love that we have for the New Zealand environment, to a realisation that we cannot do this on our own. those trained in Western science can only go so far, and it's not enough because of all the problems that we have. Those steeped in taha Māori can't do it on their own because there's so many parts of what is needed to be done in a solution that's outside of their control. And it's really only when we have our knowledge systems working together on a common purpose that we will really see the changes that need to be made in environmental policy in New Zealand, and that we will actually be able to halt the decline of biodiversity and bring back to healthier states our species. No one can do it by themselves, and no one knowledge system can do it by itself.
Another question, sorry, I was just writing notes again. Oh, there we go, in the middle.
So I'm never one to shy away from asking dangerous questions. Well, stupid questions maybe. So just recount some what I do. I have collected water before and looked for fish DNA in it, and didn't really talk to anybody about it other than the scientist who was going to do the genetics on it. So where do you draw the line and how much rigour you have in terms of consulting, etc., versus perhaps all the other end of the spectrum you might put taking blood samples from humans? So yeah, just there's a whole spectrum there, and yeah, I certainly for one haven't perhaps done due diligence at the lower end of the spectrum looking for DNA in water.
Can I ask a question? Beck, why are you looking for DNA in water?
To look for mostly for exotic fish, brown trout,
And why does that matter?
because we're trying to get rid of them.
And does that matter to Māori? Does it matter to Pākehā?
Matters to Fish and Game and trout fishermen. I can't really talk for Māori. We know that brown trout are a major threat to our native non-migratory galaxids, so I would hope it matters to Māori.
I would suggest having a talk with a Māori. I know a few, so put you in touch with them later.
There's quite a few in the room.
I see your point, right? I mean, the issue here is that you see some value, perhaps not to yourself, perhaps to understanding the system, and you want to take action. And I think that it's laudable that scientists see a problem that they can bring their skills to. But there is a point where I think you have to say, who does this benefit? And if you're not talking to those people who it benefits and those people who it perhaps doesn't benefit, then that's a problem. Right? I think that, scientists have this feeling that consultation with Maori or collaboration with Maori is a problem. And every time I've been involved, it's never been a problem. It's always been a benefit.
It's an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that's, I guess all scientists have that little bit in them that they're going to do whatever the hell they're going to do, and they're going to do it well, and and it's all about their own publication, or it's all about their own thought processes. It's quite joyful to bring other people in and say, actually, I have some skills that may be able to help in this situation, and to recognise that there are other skills that help in that situation too. I'm not turning you off here. I was like, and did you find your fish?
And 2 of the 3 times we found brown trout where, well, we didn't find them where we thought they weren't, but we did find them where they were. The 3rd time we found them, there's a paper Banks et al. 2016, finally.
And
but,
you've made all the DNA sequences available on GenBank.
Yeah, I'm sure Jonathan has done that.
Just following on from that as well, I know as a facilitator I shouldn't really get involved in the conversation, but as a Māori that deals a lot with consultation and engagement, I would love to see myself out of the job in years to come where basically anyone, Pākehā Māori, feel empowered to have the conversation with Māori. It's not about we'll go get a Māori to talk to a Māori. It's actually, I feel comfortable going to talk to iwi or going to talk to mana whenua about this. End of the day, you're there for a reason. Like obviously, you're there to protect the water, so that's something you have in common with, despite who it is. You're going to be able to talk to them on that level. How you go about it is the next step, and that's where you can have that conversation right from the start. All right, there was another question in the middle.
I actually thought that, hi Tammy, hi Peter, love you both. I actually think that was a slightly glib response though, and I think that it comes back, we can unpack that a little bit more. Okay, you guys have, for the sake of this argument, and probably with thought to what the audience and what the other people on the panel are interested in and things, you've more or less now defined genetic data as being molecular genetic data. And I think this is actually an interesting point. So when it comes to fish monitoring, is it the taking of the DNA from the water or the analysis of that, or is it the monitoring of the fish that needs to be consulted? Is genetics actually, I think that makes my point, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you so much for making it. Surely the point is the research project. I don't do genetics because genetics is fun. It is fun. It's awesome. You should all do it. But I do it because I want to address a particular question. That may be a ridiculous question about the development of fruit flies, or it may be a question about how we better protect our bees. And that's the bit you should be consulting on. Why am I doing this? Who does it benefit? And that genetics is part of that. What can the genetics bring, and how will we deal with the data? So isn't that's the conversation? The fact that there's genetic data in there is good, from my point of view, and it brings, when you start sequencing things, it brings some obligations around what you do with those sequences, and to discuss that and to have a data plan, which everyone should have. But actually the point to consult on is the project. What is this for? Why is this important? Why are we doing it? What benefit does it bring? Is that?
And I think I would add to that, and again, I just will reflect on my own personal experience in terms of this idea of consultation. I find is a bit tired, and what we should be doing is looking to co-develop research questions with relevant Māori communities and relevant spaces. And what I found personally for myself is that for those projects where I am doing this and I approach perhaps a runanga that affiliates with that particular species, and I say, I'm doing this on this species, are you interested? They're busy and they're rarely interested. But when I approach a runanga and say, I've got these skills and these are my interests, are they of interest to you? We co-develop a question that is leaps and bounds more exciting and more compelling and more meaningful together. So for me, it's not about the genetic data. For me, it's about the questions, and it's about the co-development of the questions. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna. I don't want to say that we can do this for every research project that we do, but we should be striving to do it with at least some of them. And relationships lead to more relationships, and the more we build meaningful relationships, the easier it will be to do. The more we resist building relationships, it will keep being hard.
Oh man, 3 questions. We only have time for, I'll tell you what, probably one more question. Sorry, we'll go 2 actually. Put your hand up the highest if you, there we go, there's a really urgent question.
Hi, this is fabulous to have this conversation, having sort of come back from being in Australia for the last 5 years. New Zealand's light years ahead in this discussion, so it's fabulous. But my question is just then, how do you contain the international collections issue, which you touched on with the Huia and South Island kokako? So how, that, yes, in New Zealand, hopefully that these conversations and collaborations will happen, but how do you deal with those collections and that genetic information that's already out there?
I want Mel to answer that question, actually. Well, do you want me to give it a go? Well, I don't know that I have the answer, but I know that we absolutely need to have the conversation. So case in point, when I found the mitogenome study and looked at it, one of the authors is a renowned behavioral ecologist, and I think it's ignorance that results in publications like that. And so part of what we need to do is to perhaps respond softly. But at the same time, for me, the best solutions come both bottom up and top down. So we can think about the model that we might have with editorial boards and start raising those conversations, writing letters to the editor. Those are the kinds of things that I think we can do from a top-down approach. But from a bottom-up approach, I think it has to be just, for me personally, it's developed case by case. So I'm in a particular project with a particular community. How do you want to handle this data? What do you want this data to look like? How do you want this data to be accessed? What protections do we have to put in place should this genome ever be used in a commercial context? So I think we need to, it's got to come at a whole bunch of different angles, and it is the decolonization of science. Those collections exist because of colonization. And so we have to own that and start to strategize how we can decolonize those collections. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, you know, the response to international issues is always what you do at home. It's your local response. And as long as we have the right processes domestically, so that the minute that an international scientist makes contact with a New Zealand-based scientist, it all just kicks in. The domestic process of consulting with Māori kicks in. 2 years ago, I went to a meeting in Washington that was convened by IBM and National Geographic. IBM are underwriting National Geographic's work on de-extinction. And National Geographic are interested in de-extinction because, as their president said, they've already discovered all of life on Earth. An incredibly arrogant statement to make, but nevertheless, they've discovered it. And it holds no great interest for them because they don't believe there's any new super species out there that they haven't already found. And they've found all the cultures in the world. And now what they want to do is to bring back extinct species. That's the thought process and the rationale behind bringing the huia back, bringing the moa back, and bringing many other, the mammoth, the woolly mammoth. And it's when you get into these sorts of meetings and you see that this kind of scientific endeavour is going on totally outside of any social, cultural, moral or ethical considerations. This is when a crazy, ambitious idea is unregulated and the mind is just allowed to go where the crazy scientists want it to go. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's a good place to go. But coming back to my response, as long as we have our processes in place here and everyone in New Zealand follows them, it shouldn't be an issue for us. We should be able to bring back the ethics into the research. I want to make a point that I feel like I'm missing a cultural metaphor because a number have referred to this Pollyanna woman. And I have no idea what the metaphor of Pollyanna is, so I'd be grateful if somebody would tell me, because I think I'm missing something.
Well, I know, but I think someone else might be able to tell you.
Can I have a crack at this question too? Because I think this is a really critically important question, and I'm sorry, I have to disagree. I was in Vienna recently, and I think there are more dead kakapo in the museum in Vienna than there are in New Zealand, right? So if somebody wants to sequence kakapo, then they have all the materials they need. There's no question, and there's no reason for them to contact us if they don't wish to. And I feel like we ignore that at our risk, right? It's not the case that they have to come to us. They have already come to us. They've taken our flora and fauna, and it's in museums all over the place. I won't tell that story. We don't have time. It's a good one. I will hear it later. So what I don't understand is why this is an issue. Every journal in the world publishing in human genetics requires ethics statements. We require a statement of thingamajig, commercial use. We require all kinds of things. Why can there not be a requirement for meaningful engagement with the indigenous guardians of a particular species? Why is that not possible? I think that's one answer to the question. We can go to journals and demand that this is the case, otherwise we lose out. I think the second and most important point is we're missing the trick here too. We sit and we wail and moan because other people have seen the value of our indigenous species and are sequencing them. Where is the funding and the ability for us to do it ourselves? Right? It's not good enough. There is not a funding mechanism for me to sequence the genome of a Hector's dolphin, because it's not a Marsden question and it's not an Endeavour Fund question. Yet, surely what we should be taking responsibility, the best way to take responsibility is to have meaningful, sensible engagement with the guardians of these species and working with them, sequence that information ourselves. That will solve this problem instantly. Now, what I'm asking you to do right now is take $10 out of it. All right, maybe a bit far, but this is the problem. If we are worried about this, then as taxpayers, we need to pay more money into the science system for us to be able to work in the proper way and do this well.
That answer was a great combination of crazy and ambitious.
Which bit was crazy?
Can I make a couple of small points?
Yes, yeah.
I'm going to go back to an earlier question, but first, who was it, Neal Reach, maybe it was a Harvard geneticist and a bunch of other people, I don't know, and which is telling, because I know all the Native American DNA research, I mean, a lot of them, right? So there was a bunch of people on this recent paper that I don't know that was published in Nature on the Chaco Canyon and an archaeology find, and they didn't do any consultation or very, very little with the indigenous communities in that area because they said cultural affiliation can't be demonstrated. Well, but they're defining cultural affiliation as knowledge of direct genetic descent. So that a lot of these young geneticists who have gone through our summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics are now graduated doing postdocs or assistant professors, are leading the way with some of us more senior faculty, both geneticists and bioethicists. They're writing we just submitted a piece to commentary in Nature, calling for museums, calling for and for Nature and other kinds of top journals to get together and think more about those ethics statements, right? Because we realize that we can't be relying on the research review boards of different institutions. I've been at too many universities in my short career. And what I have realized is that Arizona State University is much more rigorous after the Havasupai thing in regulating research with indigenous communities, and Berkeley was terrible. They were more interested in me protecting scientists' reputations than they were interested in worrying about, the scientists were the vulnerable subjects at Berkeley and not indigenous people. It was fascinating. So given the kind of very localized approaches of different institutions, it would be good if we had sort of some more kind of macro level documents. And the other thing on that, I wanted to say earlier about a question, maybe the first question. I don't know what you have down here, but in Canada, and one of the reasons that I like working there, although I'm an American with low standards, so keep that in mind, because my Indigenous colleagues there don't think I'm critical enough, but, give me time. They have national guidelines of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research about how to work with Indigenous communities, and I don't know if you have them, but to me, they're great guidelines. They are just the kinds of things that we so-called radicals were advocating for south of the border, but these became federal policy and federal guidelines, and they include things like when you sign a research contract, you have a certain amount of respect for Indigenous knowledge. You find ways to build capacity, scientific knowledge and research capacity within the community. You respect their regulations. They had a policy called DNA on Loan, a very short article published by Laura Arbour, a geneticist at UVic, and Doris Cook from CIHR, talking about the stewardship of DNA and the data and being willing to sign on to that. So they were a really great set of guidelines that I think are very helpful to get back to the earlier question about what counts as rigorous consent. Something like that would be more rigorous than this kind of piecemeal consultation that sometimes happens by people who just haven't been in the game long enough, I think, a lot of times. So.
Kia ora. Well, that brings us to an end, unfortunately. There's some great conversations and great topics being discussed. Hei te otinga, tuatahi tēnei te wero atu ki a koutou ngai Māori, o tātou ngai Māori. E hara tēnei mea I te mātauranga Pākehā me te mātauranga Māori, e rereke, me rāranga ēnei whakaro e rua. So moving forward, I think a collaborative approach. Some of the notes I also took away was just moral consideration. What is our questions? What questions are we asking? The concept of ownership. I think no one actually claims to own genetic data, so perhaps even rephrasing the question to ourselves could be a way to start thinking about it more. So before we do wrap up, I just want to thank you all for speaking, my lovely relations. And on behalf of the challenge and I guess the audience here, we've just got you a little something. So please join me in giving them a round of applause.